Greetings children. Welcome to my channel Inside Accountancy by Shakun. Today we'll be talking about Chapter 8 Journal, and the contents of this video are Goods and Services Tax, Journal entries relating to GST, examples based on the above. Now what is Goods and Services Tax? Casually it is normally called as GST. Now GST is a comprehensive indirect tax. GST has replaced about 17 indirect taxes levied by the state governments and central government under the previous indirect tax regime. So 17 indirect taxes have been replaced by one tax, that is GST. GST can be collected by only such person who is a registered taxpayer under GST. GST is a value added tax since GST paid is always set off against the GST collected. GST is paid at the time of purchases and GST is collected at the time of sales. As a result, it is levied on the incremental value. GST is a destination-based indirect tax and it is charged every time a sale is made till the time the goods or services reach the customer, that is, they are not sold further. So basically, it is a destination-based tax. So, as I already explained, it is a comprehensive indirect tax that is charged each time the supply is made. So, whenever the sales are made, this tax is charged. It is charged by only that person who is a registered taxpayer, and the rates are also prescribed by the government. It cannot be charged by any person who is an unregistered taxpayer, and it can also not be charged by a registered taxpayer once the goods or services reach their final destination. That means that it cannot be charged by a person in case the goods have reached their final destination. Now, what is the final destination? That means when the goods reach the consumers and they get consumed. So, it cannot be charged after that. GST is charged and collected by the seller of the goods or services and paid by the purchaser of goods or services. So the seller, when he makes the sales, he collects GST, and the purchaser, when he makes the purchase, he makes a payment for GST. The net effect, or when the GST is set off, that amount is paid to the government. Moving on. The categories of GST. GST is categorized into three categories. First is Central Goods and Services Tax, State Goods and Services Tax, Integrated Goods and Services Tax. Now, CGST and SGST are levied on intra-state transactions. Intra-state supply or sale. Intra-state means within a state. So, whenever a transaction occurs within a state, then CGST and SGST shall apply. And integrated goods and services tax, that is IGST, is levied on interstate transactions. Interstate means the transactions between different states. Now, in case of CGST and SGST, in intra-state transactions, both of them are charged at half the prescribed rate of GST. The prescribed rate, if is 12%, that means half will be charged as CGST and half will be charged as SGST. That is, if it is 12% or 6% each. But in case of integrated goods and services tax in interstate transactions, IGST is charged only at the prescribed rate of GST. That is, if it is 12%, so the whole 12% will be charged as IGST. So there are three categories: CGST, SGST and IGST. CGST and SGST are in case of intrastate transactions and IGST is in case of interstate transactions, means outside the state. Now let's talk about input GST and output GST, two very important terms that are commonly used in relation to GST and its accounting treatment. So input GST. Input GST is the GST that is paid by the purchaser of goods or services. So if the business is making purchase of raw materials, the amount of GST that the business pays is known as input GST. So at the time of purchase, the GST that is paid is known as input GST. Input GST has a debit balance. Why debit balance? Because it is treated as an asset, because ultimately what we have paid, we are going to set it off against the amount that we will collect as GST when we make the sales. So when we make purchases, we pay GST in the form of input GST, which is an asset because it will be recovered when we collect GST at the time of sales. Again, inputs GST is categorized as input CGST, input SGST, input IGST, depending upon the intra or interstate transactions. Output GST is collected by the seller of goods or services. Okay, so when we make the sales, at that time when we collect GST, that is referred to as output GST. Again, it is categorized as output CGST, output SGST, and output IGST. Output GST has a credit balance because it is a liability. So if I have a business and I collect GST at the time of sales, that is not my income. That GST is a tax which I am collecting, and it will ultimately be paid to the government. Okay, so if I have a business and I purchase raw material and pay GST, that is input GST is paid by me, and at the same time when the goods are finished and I sell them to the customers, then I collect GST, that is output GST. So the difference between the two, suppose I pay 10,000 and I collect 15,000. So my input GST is 10,000, my output GST is 15,000. The difference between the two, that is 5,000, is paid to the government. So these are two very important terms. Moving on, let's talk about the journal entries relating to GST. In case of purchase of goods, now obviously the purchase can be made either within the state or outside the state. If it is within the state, you have to understand that within the state transactions are linked with CGST and SGST. Input obviously will be there. See, two things you have to remember. First is, since it is an intra-state transaction, therefore CGST and SGST will apply. And if it is an interstate transaction, then IGST will apply. Now, at the time of purchases, since we pay CGST and SGST, so that is referred to as input. Okay, so purchase account, you know, is always debited. Being a nominal account, it is debited. Input CGST, input SGST, both are the GST that has been paid. It is an asset, therefore they are also debited to the creditor from whom the purchases are made, or if the purchases are made through cash or through check, then cash or bank may be credited. Okay, now if in case it is an interstate purchase, inter means outside the state, that means IGST will apply, and since it is purchase, we are making a payment of GST, so therefore input will also be shown here. So at the time of purchase of goods, just think about the basic transaction. If I just omit this input, just basic transaction will be purchases account DR to creditor or cash or bank. This you all know. Now you have to remember, in case of purchase, it is always input. Okay, so input always has to be there. And the second thing that you have to remember is whether the purchase is made within the state or outside the state. If it is within the state, then CGST, SGST. If it is outside the state, then IGST. Okay, so within the state, CGST, SGST, and outside the state, IGST. And in case of purchases, that is input, which has a DR balance. In case of purchase of assets, when assets are purchased, asset account is debited, and from the person from whom we are purchasing is credited, or if cash is paid or the check is paid, then cash or bank or creditor accordingly will be credited. Now again we apply our conditions. First we have to see whether this is a intra-state purchase or interstate purchase. So if it is an intra-state purchase, then CGST, SGST shall apply. And if it is an interstate purchase, then IGST shall apply. And then since it is a purchase, so that means it is input. Why? Because we are making a payment for this GST and it is an asset. Therefore, at the time of intra-state purchases, input CGST, input SGST will be debited. And in case of interstate purchases, input IGST will be debited. Moving on, in case of purchase return means the goods which have been purchased earlier due to their defects or not according to their standards, they are returned back. So in that case also the same rule will apply, but we are going to reverse the transaction. At the time of purchase, input CGST and SGST was debited. Now you are returning the goods. So that means input CGST and input SGST, which had already been paid, now has to be reversed. Therefore, input CGST and input SGST are credited. Okay. So the basic entry is creditor, cash, bank, etc. debit to purchase return. In this entry, we are reversing the input CGST, SGST. And in case of interstate transactions, it will be input IGST, which will be reversed. Moving on, in case of expenses, just like purchases, expense account is debited and cash or bank or outstanding expense account is credited. Now, if it is an expense, so obviously input account will be there. It is a input GST. If it is an intra-state transaction, then it will be CGST, SGST, or if it is a interstate, then IGST. Now, let's take an example based on these entries. I've just taken a small example and I'll be journalizing it for you. First transaction is purchased goods of 20,000 from Ranjan, and there are other transactions also, but in the end it is written CGST and SGST is levied at 6% each on intrastate transactions. IGST at the rate of 12% is levied on interstate transactions. Okay, so you have purchased goods from Ranjan. The basic entry, think of the basic entry first. Your basic entry will be purchase account DR to Ranjan, right? So our basic entry is purchase should be debited with 20 and to Ranjan. I'm not writing the amount yet in case of Ranjan. Now, since this is purchase, so we know that CGST is paid. GST is paid. Since GST is paid, so I have to write input along with purchase. One thing. Secondly, is there any place written next to Ranjan? No. If nothing is given, we'll assume that it is an intrastate transaction. So if it is an intrastate transaction, then we have to apply CGST and SGST. So therefore, input CGST and input SGST are debited. They were each 6%. So purchase value was 20,000. 6% of 20,000 is 1,200 each. That has been shown under input CGST and SGST. In Ranjan's account, we will just show the total of all the transactions. So this was the first transaction solved for you. Second, furniture purchased 10,000 from SR Furnishers, Gujarat. Now you are purchasing an asset from SR Furnishers, but they operate in Gujarat, and we operate in Delhi. Okay, so this is a intrastate or interstate. This is a interstate transaction. Therefore, furniture is debited, SR Furnishers Gujarat is credited, the basic entry, but because it is a interstate transaction, therefore input IGST is debited. We are not debiting CGST, SGST, we are debiting IGST. So now IGST was 12%. So 12% of 10,000 is 1,200, and the total I've written in SR Furnishers. Next, the third transaction is goods returned to Ranjan 5,000. Now I'm returning the goods to Ranjan from whom I had made purchases. Right, so Ranjan is the receiver, Ranjan account is debited, and I am sending the goods to him, that is purchase return. So purchase return account is credited. This is the basic entry. Now we know that in case of purchase, input CGST, SGST was debited, and now we are returning the goods, so they have to be credited. They have to be reversed basically. So the goods were returned of the value of 5,000 that I have written under purchase return. On this 5,000, 6% amounts to 3,300. So the total 5,600 is shown under Ranjan account on the DR side. The last entry is paid for printing and stationery, which is an expense. So printing and stationery debit 2,000, and the basic entry is to cash, right? But since it is an expense, we pay GST. Therefore, input CGST, input SGST is debited. Since no place is written next to it, so we assume that it is a intra-state transaction. Moving on. Now let's talk about the Journal entries in case of sale of goods, it will be just the opposite. So the basic entry in case of sale will be debtor or cash or bank account to sales. This you all know. Now in case of sales, we collect the GST. Okay. So the GST which is collected is referred with the term output. Okay. So if it is a intra-state sale, so CGST, SGST, output CGST and output SGST will be credited because it is a liability, ultimately has to be paid to the government. And if it is an interstate one, so output IGST will be credited. So in case of sale, GST is collected and GST collected is a liability referred by output. Therefore, output CGST, SGST or IGST is credited. In case of sale of assets, again the same entry, debtor, cash, bank to asset, the basic entry, but since it is a sale, so GST is collected. Therefore, output CGST, output SGST or output IGST is credited because it is a liability to be paid to the government. The next transaction is in case of sales return. We had made sales, but the other person has returned the goods back to us. So goods are coming in, sales return account DR to the debtor or cash or bank. And since this is sales return, at the time of sales, output GST was credited. Now the goods are being returned, so the entry has to be reversed. So therefore CGST, SGST is now debited. Or in case of interstate transactions, output IGST is debited. So you have to remember that at the time of sales return or purchase return, the input or output GST is reversed. Moving on, in case of incomes, again the basic entry will be cash, bank, accrued income, either of the three, to income. This is the basic entry. In case of intrastate transactions, CGST, SGST shall apply, and because in case of incomes we are receiving or we are collecting the GST, so it's a liability, so output word is attached. So output CGST, output SGST. But in case of interstate transactions, output IGST is credited. Moving on, I've taken another example. Journalize the transactions in the books of Ramit, Bangalore. Sold goods of 50,000 to Sohan. Now the place is not written here. So we know that this is a intra-state transaction. We are selling goods to Sohan. The basic entry is Sohan is the receiver to be debited, and sales, goods are being sold, so sales will be credited. That is our basic transaction. And then now we know that at the time of sales we collect GST, so output word is written, and since the place is not given, so we assume it is an intrastate transaction. Therefore CGST, SGST are both credited. Now the sale value was 50,000. On this 66% is calculated, which is CGST, SGST, and total 56,000 is written on the debit side of Sohan's account. Next transaction is furniture sold 10,000 to ABC Private Limited, Chennai. Now we are selling the furniture in Chennai. Okay, so it is a interstate transaction. Therefore, our basic entry, as you all know, furniture is going out to be credited. ABC Private Limited is the receiver to be debited. And since we are selling, so output IGST will be credited. Since we are selling, so output. And since this is a interstate transaction, therefore IGST. So the amount of furniture was 10,000. IGST 12%, that is 1200, and total amount 11,200 under ABC Private Limited. Moving on, the third transaction is goods returned by Sohan 10,000. Now we had sold goods to Sohan, now he is returning goods back to us. Goods are coming in, but these are returns. Therefore, sales return account is debited, and Sohan is the giver, so Sohan's account is credited. Now at the time of sales, output CGST, SGST was credited. Now we are going to reverse it. Therefore, output CGST, SGST are now being debited because we just reversed it. Now the goods are returned of the value of 10,000. On that 66% amounts to 6,600. So total 11,200 is the amount that is credited to Sohan. The last entry is commission received. Since it is received, that means it is an income. So the entry will be cash to commission or cash to income. I have written, you can write commission here. So cash to commission is the basic entry. Now since this is an income, we know that we are going to collect the GST, therefore the word output. And since nothing is mentioned here, so we know it is a intrastate transaction, therefore CGST and SGST is credited. So on 1000 at the rate of 66%, that is 60/60. So total is 1120. So I hope these transactions are clear to everybody. In this video, we have talked about the journal, goods and services tax, journal entries relating to GST with a lot of examples based on it. I hope the concepts were clear to you. If you liked my content, please like my video, show some love, subscribe to my channel, hit the bell button in case you want to get notified. Any doubts, queries, email me or leave a comment in the comment section below. Thank you so much for listening to me so patiently.